Echoing Tony Abbott's past remarks about lifestyle choices, WA Liberal MP Dennis Jensen says Indigenous Australians living a noble, savage lifestyle should not be subsidised by the taxpayer. And just 2 weeks after the Prime Minister spoke about closing the gap, Dr Jensen has called for an end to policies made specifically for Indigenous Australians. Dennis Jensen, welcome to RN Drive.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Why did you make these statements in Parliament this week?
Because I am very concerned with where we are going as far as the Indigenous community is concerned. You have had effectively 40 years now of programs being rolled out and you've seen very little gain. It's like having a maths test. You do it the first time with a pencil and you fail. So you do the same maths test tomorrow, same answers, but you use a pen this time and you think that you might pass. The reality is the programs that we've had are similar to changing the pencil to the pen, but the substance is the same and they're demonstrably not working. And quite frankly, part of that is because we have policies that are, to call a spade, racist policies. They're based on race.
What is the purpose of calling Indigenous Australians who live in remote communities noble savages? Do you realise how offensive that term is to Indigenous Australians?
Well, let's go through that issue. First of all, I didn't refer to them as noble savages. I referred to a noble savage view
which is arguably the same thing, isn't it? That's how people interpret it.
Let me continue, please. A view that was espoused by, although it's debated, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and basically the view was that this whole noble savage thing was that you had people that were uncontaminated by civilization and so therefore representative of an ideal human being. So in that context, it's actually not at all a negative sentiment. Now, what I would further said was that I saw the reality of those remote communities being somewhat Hobbesian in terms of life being brutal and short. And that I was laying the contrast there between the two views on that sort of lifestyle, and I am appalled by those remote communities and the fact that you're getting kids that are being born and brought up in those communities with no hope in hell of ever getting a decent education, certainly never getting a job.
Isn't one of the reasons they're not getting a decent education because the state is giving them substandard education in their communities? I can tell you, I've been to these remote communities. I've actually been to quite a few of them, so I have got some experience in this area, and some of the schools are appalling.
Well, how about communities where you've got 4 people? What sort of school do you have there?
They're called outstations. They're not full remote communities.
They still remote, defined as remote communities, and the simple fact is, okay, make it 10 people. The simple fact is those communities, you're never going to be able to have a decent education, get a job. We would not accept and have the taxpayer fund that sort of community with any non-Indigenous group of people. And so we should not be have the taxpayer funding those sort of communities with the Indigenous
community. Do you accept,
either.
Dr Jensen, that by referring to the noble savage concept, by raising that you have offended lots of Indigenous Australians, and that it's not particularly constructive to have a discussion where you offend the first Australians of this country?
I think that what you have is a group of people that choose to be offended in that context. Certainly when you look at my speech and you have a look at that in context, there's no way that I was being offensive.
Okay,
so,
but people have been
I don't
offended.
Resolve from that. Well, people can choose to be offended by all sorts of things, and I don't think that simply because people choose to be offended, suddenly someone needs to
So you would
apologise.
Use the terminology again? You would give the same speech? You would not change your language or your approach to have a debate in a more constructive way?
I think the reality is when you read the speech in context, the meaning is clear.
We went through this debate almost a year ago after Tony Abbott's lifestyle choices comment, no doubt you remember. Did you listen to any of the responses he received at the time?
I heard some of the responses. The problem is that people are too busy thinking about, oh, how offensive this person's being, or this comment's offensive. What is offensive is the standard of living and indeed those gaps that you have between the Indigenous community and the rest of Australia on so many measures. And, I mean, throwing around epithets and sort of ad hominems about people is not solving that problem at all. Let's get down to the guts of the problem, which is exactly what I was trying to do.
Dr Jensen, Indigenous people that live in cities and Indigenous people that live in regional communities also suffer these kind of very poor health outcomes, this shorter life expectancy. What makes you think that if you closed down remote communities and moved them all to a big centre, that their health and that their opportunities would go up? Where's the evidence that that's happened?
The simple thing is, when you have Indigenous programs where specifically directed at Indigenous people, you're also at the same time sending out a very negative message. You're saying to that community, well, without all of this additional help that the rest of the community doesn't get, you wouldn't be able to compete. Now, I think that is a self-actualising and dreadful way of going about it. Removing those impediments and then dealing with the issues. And I fully accept and agree that there are issues that affect the Indigenous community more than other parts of the community. It's the same as certain other aspects affect other aspects of society more than others. So if there are
issues that affect Indigenous people in really profound ways, and you've named them, you've said they're dying earlier, that these are issues that you're
Deal with the issue, not with the race. With the issue.
But they're the people being affected. So how can you remove the policies that are specifically dealing with that problem? How could you take it away?
For example, the situation with employment. Indigenous employment, there's far less, the Indigenous are employed far less than the rest of society. But here's the kicker. When you have a look at people that have got degree qualifications, the employment rate's about the same. So what that's saying is, what's the issue that you need to deal with? The issue that you need to deal with is education. And that should be the thing that we are focusing on, and not Indigenous-specific education, education for everyone. And so if you get areas of disadvantage, you deal with disadvantage and the problems related to education.
What would you say to Indigenous people who describe a connection with their land and say that they don't want to leave their communities because they have a unique connection with that land? What would you say to an Indigenous person who made that case?
Well, if they feel that way, and I don't dispute that they might, and you talk about this traditional way of living, the traditional way of living didn't incorporate things like taxpayer funding. So, I mean, somewhere or another, you need to.
But that ignores the fact that colonisation has happened and made it impossible for them to live like they did before colonisation. How can you ignore colonisation in that process? How can you pretend it didn't have an impact on them? That's completely insane.
Apart from Antarctica, we're the least populated continent on Earth. So there are a whole lot of areas that are, as we've been describing, extremely remote. They're not populated. You've got native title and so on in the areas where they actually lived. So they absolutely have the opportunity to live the lifestyle that they lived 250 years ago.
The Labor Party and the Greens say that you should be basically rebuked by the Prime Minister. If he does have a word to you, what would you say to him?
Well, I'll explain my position and why I did it, and the fact that, quite frankly, Indigenous policy has been an absolute unmitigated disaster. You just have to have a look at the results. And that for us to continue trying to do the same thing is like that maths test I was talking about earlier. The simple fact is we need to have a fundamental, comprehensive look at this issue, and in my view, the way that you go about rectifying things is you don't try to fix an imbalance by putting in another imbalance. You don't try to fix an injustice by putting in another injustice. You actually deal with every single Australian using the same framework.
Dr Dennis Jensen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's Dr Dennis Jensen. He's a Liberal MP from Western Australia who's, well, the Labor Party and the Greens say the Prime Minister should Well, should discipline him effectively for comments he made, which were very controversial in the Parliament. We invited him on. A few people have asked questions. Why did we invite him on? Well, I'll tell you why. He's an MP in the Parliament. He's given a speech. Many people are upset about it. Other people agree with it. And I thought it was time to ask him questions about why he had those views. And that's exactly what I did. Our number